As we stand at the outset of the first major drive for a digital takeover, as Warner Brothers gamble their future and hedge their bets on HBO Max, I can't help but notice a common thread in their lineup. Looking at their slate of major blockbuster releases, they're still fixated on that elusive Avengers event jackpot. 2 weeks ago, the Snyder Cut. A second chance for DC Comics to unite various heroes to jumpstart a shared franchise. 2 days from now, the Godzilla vs. Kong Monsterverse crossover. And 2 weeks after that, the Mortal Kombat reboot that producers are already laying the foundation for a Marvel-style setup. In 1 year and 1 month's time, it will have been a decade since Marvel Studios' landmark film. And if we can dispense with the monkey see, flunky do justifications of why movie companies have desperately sought this path, I know I can't be the only one who is damn sick and tired of the attempts at crossovers. I'm at the point of looking at cinematic shared universes like I am looking at cinematic 3D movies. I'm like, they still make you? This crap is as outdated as public phone booths. And probably twice as filthy. I'd like to say that any hope has been abandoned, just like finding good music on the radio, but I didn't have any hope for anyone making a franchise for reasons other than a good story to tell. Now notice something. Beforehand, I said attempts at crossovers. As in, the many who've traveled this road never even arrived at their destination. Before we go into detail over the aimless landscape that this fool's errand has left movie studios in, I'd like to single out one film company in particular, which is not only the one that this video is named after, but the main one that so pitifully threw out such a Hail Mary attempt at monetary gain and relevance, that of Universal Studios. Let's take a closer look at the output of the company that sought to reintroduce to the masses horror's greatest villains in a fashion-fitting Earth's Mightiest Heroes? Universal Studios. While it is true that horror cinema's true origins lie in the silent era of the 1910s and 20s, the touchstones of this generation were made by separate movie studios. It wasn't until 1931, Jewish immigrant Carl Laemmle and his son kickstarted what would become the genre's first great era under one roof, that being of Universal Studios. The release of Dracula and Frankenstein in the same year would not only usher in mad scientists and undead monarchs, men-turned-monsters, and iconic brides, but Gothic legends now became movie icons in an age so prosperous that it lasted nearly a quarter of a century. But folks, that was 90 years ago. What have they done for us lately? It would be far too easy and fun to jump right in with our granddaddy film company's exploits within our favorite genre, but if you'll indulge me, I prefer a little foreplay before we get down and dirty. I'm old-fashioned. When we look into what Universal has been up to outside of horror, we get a better idea of how this company's run and what their focus is. In the late 2000s, when everybody was exploiting fantasy films to capitalize on Twilight's fame, they pinched out Snow White and that Robin Hood remake for some reason. When they noticed how Paramount was raking in money with Transformers and G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra, the film company decided to get in bed with Hasbro and made Battleship. Ouch, how'd that turn out? Speaking of late to the game, what has been the genre that's been all the rage since 2000's X-Men film? Well, comic book movies, you dunce. Haven't you been listening? What were the bargain chips that Universal Studios plunked down on the gambling table? Cowboys and Aliens. Oblivion. R.I.P.D. If it ain't obvious already, this studio wasted hundreds of millions, if not billions, chasing fads that failed to franchise. Now, if that dumpster fire didn't whet your appetite, remember, that's just the appetizer. When we look at what Universal Studios has, and I use this word loosely, contributed within horror, well, I'll let you be the judge. Take stock of the studio that greenlit Devil by M. Night Shyamalan. Remember him? The Millennium Savior of the horror films? Oh, and they also commissioned Dead Silence, the first major knock on the resume of James Wan, the most recent savior of horror films. Yeah. When you're looking for a liberator, maybe don't buy into the hype so you don't count them chickens before they come home to roost. You like alien movies? Well, isn't Universal Studios responsible for that cinematic black hole called Skyline? Oh, and that Riddick film? And as far as reboots go, didn't they make the Thing 2011 prequel? And by the way, the Doom movie? Talk about failures to launch. They had the chance to finally close the gap between gaming and film and establish the first video game adaptation as a survival horror game, and with such a seminal title as Doom, and they botched it. I'm not liking their chances at managing their own gothic forefathers of the Universal monsters. And speaking of, if those examples didn't already expose their mishandling of horror, franchises, or other film genres, when you expand upon their bread and butter of classic monsters, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they sanitize the Mummy trilogy so much so that it left us with the kid-friendly Mummy Returns all the way down to the unwatchable Tomb of the Dragon Emperor? Didn't they water down the Children of the Night with the Van Helsing film and blew $150 million on that Wolfman remake? What in anyone's mind who bothered to pay attention made any carbon-based life form think that this studio was up to the challenge of cultivating the hallowed ground of bringing back the monster series that popularized the horror genre to the mainstream? Do you even realize that every blunder that I just named happened within a 20-year period? As in the last 20 years? Now, let's take a look at the competition, or lack thereof, that Marvel faced after its crossover sensation and how they fared with their own Xeroxed attempts to cash in. I'd like to now take a step back to how other studios reacted when they saw what was on the horizon for the first Avengers event, and especially after its $1.5 billion box office. It's hard to remember, even looking back a decade ago, that there were in fact 3 other studios that had their own superhero films even before Marvel's major pop culture phenomenon. It's hard remembering because not only did the Avengers represent such a quantum leap in terms of impact and appeal, but bear in mind, 2 of the 3 competing film companies even owned the rights to other Marvel characters, with Fox's X-Men and of course, Sony's Spider-Man. So, what was the game plan to provide an answer to Marvel's blockbuster spectacle? Why, to shamelessly copy their same formula, you dunce. Haven't you been listening? And boy, the places that they went. Fox attempted to be the first to the finish line by presenting their bluish brute boss battle and cut every corner imaginable to debut Apocalypse. When they weren't botching the reveal of such a beloved villain, they were straight up lying to fans with Days of Futures Past, with a crossover of the First Class generation working with the OG X-Men. Yeah, watch that movie again. There is no team-up. The only interactions between past and present were Wolverine and Charles Xavier, which, if you ever saw the movie Logan, you know those are the only 2 characters that this franchise ever gave a damn about. Sony, taking the nuanced approach of the 3, instead opted to go all in, and, noticing a wall named Bad Ideas, dove in teeth first. Not being able to resist that siren song of Avengers money, they said to themselves, Hey, we're Sony, and love doing things more than once. We've already rebooted Spider-Man, so why not botch another attempt at a Sinister Six after we couldn't even get it off the ground with the Sam Raimi trilogy? And botch they did. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 proved such a brain hemorrhage that not only did they have to reboot their prize horse character 2 years later after rebooting him 2 years prior, his only saving grace was in the crossover film of the studio they were trying to compete with.
Brilliant! Brilliant!
As far as DC is concerned, Jesus, do I even? If anyone watching this believes that the previously released Snyder Cut is any kind of redemption for Warner Brothers, unchecked money grubbing over fast-tracking a hero team-up, bypassing standalone setup, and ultimately makes amends for Joss Whedon's butchering of the Justice League movie, you do realize that DC never learned their lesson to stop copying Marvel, right? Because I can assure you, they most certainly kept at it, one failed attempt after another. Instead of the team-up film, they did the heroes battling each other, and you got Batman vs. Superman in 2016. That same year, the Suicide Squad failed to materialize into DC's Guardians of the Galaxy. The Shazam experiment to show a more lighthearted side of the DC comics was shown the door and left the box office with empty pockets. Margot Robbie's sexist vanity project, The Collapse of Harley Quinn, crashed and burned any hopes she had to be the female Deadpool. And that stroke of genius came out just last year. Look, I could go on, but this is one of the biggest points of this shared universe circus. Not even Marvel's biggest competitors were successful at this endeavor, so why would anyone think it a good idea that Fear Fiction should enter this arena just to get served to the lions like the other participants? Furthermore, to attempt to adapt a Caped Crusader formula into a monster genre when it isn't even your area of expertise was asinine. This ain't open mic night. It was a blood sport with how bad Marvel mopped the floor with these studios when they weren't even trying. So with that in mind, enough with the heroes and let's get back to the horrors. We now come to the man of the hour. The man tapped to shepherd the tailspin of remaking the Gothic classics. It is appropriate that Alex Kurtzman, director of the 2017 Mummy, should hold an interview to explain the dark universe on that pop culture wasteland that is IGN. Without further ado, this interview is about as true to form as I would expect a dubiously worded, misleading fluff piece would be.
I tend to feel like the best way to build a universe is to deliver individual, satisfying films, and if the audiences like those films, the universe will begin to build itself.
Bitch, please!
You built the dark universe, and the fans were all too eager to foreclose that property for you. This Clown Shoes director and others like him were the ones that put the cart before the horse, and when no one hopped on that carriage for a ride, that horse done got shipped to the glue factory.
While the idea of a shared universe brings to mind comic book movies, Kurtzman was keen to point out that the monsters got there first.
Obviously, Marvel did an amazing job starting with Iron Man, but people forget that the monsters were the first shared universe, starting with Frankenstein meets Wolfman. And they said, well, what are we going to do? What if we put them together? And suddenly a new story was born, and it was actually really exciting to see, and that birthed a million monster crossovers. So the monsters were the first shared universe.
No, Cupcake. People would like to forget. Those films weren't any kind of success story, but were in fact a new low for those respective films. To attempt his spin of reframing these movies as landmark horror is the height of insincerity that just serves to justify his greed-fueled exploitation of a beloved franchise. Full stop. He continues that
And the reason that worked was because they had already done 3 Frankenstein films, and they'd already done Wolfman films, and the audience loved both characters, and they kind of ran out of gas with those stories.
Again, this is that tried and true manipulation tactic of revisionist history. The attempt to recontextualize a bad investment as a big win is false advertisement, meant to generate artificial hype amongst fans for this studio scheme. Furthermore, no one in their right mind purchased a ticket to 2012's Avengers and thought to themselves, "Mank, this is just like Frankenstein meets Wolfman, Mank. Don't you mean King Kong vs. Godzilla? Juno? I think you're right, Mank." No one talks like that. Those movies were borderline parodies, and no thing that nobody ever looked at as classic films, especially horror fans. Need evidence? Let's take a gander at this article. Avengers is so much more than a sequel. It's something that, to my knowledge, has never been attempted before. It's a culmination of 4 separate film franchises coming together under one roof and then, presumably, blowing it right the hell off. The only examples I can think of that brought franchises together in such a way is Freddy vs. Jason and Alien vs. Predator, and, well, those pretty much pale in comparison. What's the source of that article? Ouch. Bet you thought no one'd notice. Need further proof? When approached with a script for the crossover Alien vs. Predator, James Cameron famously balked. You do that, you're gonna kill the validity of the franchise, in my mind. Because to me, that was Frankenstein meets werewolf. It was Universal just taking their assets and starting to play them off against each other. Ouch. Bet you thought no one would remember? But no, Alex Kurtzman, seriously. Frankenstein meets Wolfman and King Kong vs. Godzilla were cinematic touchstones worthy of the same walk of fame that's littered with heroin needles and homeless piss. And speaking of hypodermic poison and vagrant urine, what say we take a look at Alex Kurtzman's career, shall we? No, oh please, anything but... 2005's The Island, The Legend of Zorro, Mission Impossible 3, Transformers, Watchmen, Star Trek Into Darkness, Cowboys and Aliens, Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, Ender's Game, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Star Trek Diversity, Star Trek Picard. Hey, how's that Clarice show going? And the walking brain fart that is Clark Wolf in her crappy podcast that I'm sorry that I ever listened to actually exalted her praise over Kurtzman's election as the overlord of the Dark Universe, stating, "You couldn't have picked a better man to lead this project." Don't you worry your pretty little head if you don't recognize Clark Wolf. No one does. With all this talk of the monsters getting to a shared universe first, is there even a single exhibit of evidence that the 1963 release of the first Avengers comic references Stan Lee as citing Frankenstein meets Wolfman as an inspiration, despite coming out 20 years prior? Speaking of Marvel, I can see it now. Universal Studios seeing dollar signs in the caper that Avengers pulled off. They don't have any superheroes of their own. All comic book adaptations have failed. What do we do? Who do we turn to? Suddenly, a salt and pepper-haired soy boy wearing hipster glasses approaches and says, "If you're looking for a hero, I'll answer the call. I'm Alex Kurtzman, and I'll be your disappointment for the evening. I'll make the valiant sacrifice to play the Kevin Feige for your franchise and guide it like he did with every Marvel movie. Except the cruel hands of fate make for a rude awakening as they jostle you from your wet dream. You can't be Kevin Feige just because you say you are or wanna be. And please believe, wanna be is the lifetime achievement for people like Alex Kurtzman. I'll spare you reading off of Kevin Feige's resume and the billions he's made because I've already read you Alex Kurtzman's resume, so you've seen the millions he's lost."
It's hard, you know. I mean, we don't want to make these movies until they're worth making, until they're right. No, that's Marvel's domain. Maybe it'll feel more appropriate down the line as the universe builds itself, but I don't think any of us wanted to be accused of ripping off what they did so well.
Too late. We've read the obituary of the studio track record failing at film and franchise alike, explaining why their dark universe was DOA from the jump. We've seen the stale competition step up to the Marvel plate just to get the smack down before they can inevitably strike out. We've heard clickbait websites cuck out to F-grade directors. All that remains is all that is left. How did I know this Gold Digger's plot at a superhero crossover with horror monsters was never going to reach any modicum of success? Well, other than the lacking talent behind it and the purely monetary motivation, absent creative direction behind the scenes, buckle up, kiddies. For you see, I left the best chapter for dead last. I'm about to school you on why you don't want this. Brace yourselves for a history lesson.
Gentlemen, start your screaming!
Frankenstein meets Wolfman. Abbott and Costello. The Monster Squad. Transylvania 6500. Castlevania. House of Frankenstein 1997. Van Helsing. Hotel Transylvania. Do you even realize the Universal Monsters had a revival in the 90s? Penny Dreadful. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Freddy vs. Jason. Alien vs. Predator. Underworld. The Dark Universe. Why was the Dark Universe doomed to failure from the jump? Not so much that you didn't want it, but because you have never wanted this. Anyone remember Death House? That prison movie that was supposed to be the horror Expendables that was utterly forgettable? This serves as proof positive of that unwritten rule: you cannot call out a fad while it is on trend. Look at the first impressions to Resident Evil 5 and The Force Awakens. Heralded as tours de force upon release, now panned and exposed by the passage of time. Mere months afterward, to be honest. Yes, Monster Squad is an awesome movie. It's part of an 80s trilogy I plan to cover. I respect the Castlevania games, but folks, look at the laundry list of failures that I just mentioned. The only time this has ever worked was as a R-rated film for kids? Process that. And the Castlevania games had monster cameos, but went right back to Dracula anyway. From YouTube geeks to crony websites prostrating themselves as glorified spokespeople for this cinematic dead end, clapping their flippers together like trained damn seals, never once considering the blatant drawbacks.
If I may, I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Please believe that whether director, producer, or studio head, there was every intention, stated or unspoken, to turn this...
Children of the night, what music they make.
into this.
You want me to put the hammer down?
As if the aborted attempts at a shared cinematic universe weren't embarrassing enough, look at the afterbirth of what the landscape was like post-Avengers. Talk of a Shyamalan shared universe. Stephen King shared universe. Bones and Sleepy Hollow crossover. Talk of Transformers meets G.I. Joe. The Ring versus The Grudge. The Flash versus Green Arrow. Spider-Man Dark Universe. Didn't Ryan Murphy's American Horror Story Season 8 comprise of a crossover? The Dark Universe, the Monster Universe, Conjuring Universe, Cloverfield Universe. How would a Stephen King universe even work? Clowns chasing children of the cornfields where dead pets are buried, but also an Indian burial ground where the Overlook Hotel was built on top of?
Okay, Marge, you hide in the abandoned amusement park. Lisa, the pet cemetery. Bart, spooky roller disco. And I'll go skinny dipping in that lake where the sexy teens were killed 100 years ago tonight.
It's bad enough that horror had the millennium fads of J-horror, zombie apocalypse, torture porn, remakes, found footage, but this horror hero crap was worse than when the genre was chasing prequel trends and the 3D craze. This was always going to fail, and I'll do you one better. It deserved to fail. Now that the Venom movie was successful, somehow, people are clamoring for their dark take on comics with Morbius and Carnage. Guys, Sony is the same studio that mismanaged their biggest cash cow, which is why you had 3 different Spider-Men in 1 decade. You honestly expect them to expertly execute a horror universe of comic books. From the company that disgraced the Resident Evil movies. Good luck with that. So the Dud universe started out as a cash grab, turned into a joke, botched its millennial resurgence, is handled by money-grubbing incompetence, you despise its decent attempts, and there is exactly zero direction or template for these remakes and mashups to follow. You honestly think this can be pulled off in an age of incompetent charlatans and cash-in remakes? You expect that the first great film franchise will be treated with the reverence it deserves for its 90-year legacy? Surely you jest.
And don't call me Shirley.
With franchise fatigue being a real thing, superhero saturation, the significance of the aptly named Endgame, I almost want you to learn your lesson except for 2 things. Firstly, it would come at the cost of further tarnishing the legacy of the Gothic forefathers. And number 2, who am I kidding? You wouldn't learn to avoid hype trains anyway. Horror fans sure didn't learn their lesson when they touted M. Night Shyamalan as the next Steven Spielberg. The powers that be and the powers that wanna be don't have what it takes to deliver the goods. Their interest is in profit margins and bottom lines, not legacy, not lineage, not a formula for success. That's a recipe for disaster. The Dud universe has had as many false starts as Fox had climaxes to the X-Men franchise. If I can circle the wagons back to that propaganda foundry, IGN, I remember reading an article from that site that served as a prime example of a broken clock being right at least twice a day. Entitled, "Whatever Happened to Supervillains?", they revealed the importance of bad guys and the role they serve in storytelling. Gee, I wish that scary movies would learn that lesson, since the entirety of the horror genre is predicated on its villains. Maybe if that epiphany dawned, we would get a memorable movie monster again after over 20 years, instead of retreading the Gothic forefathers from 90 years ago. It leaves me asking, where are the horror icons at? Part of the reason, and an overlooked ingredient over why Kevin Feige has been successful, is because he has respect for the characters under his stewardship, and no matter the fluff piece or the advertisement, that level of reverence can't be faked. Can't be replicated, but it should be returned. And when you have some corporate suit publicly state his intention to get the horror out of the Universal monsters, you're not just off to a rough start, you're speeding towards a train wreck. And always, always remember, I ain't a big deal, I'm just the real deal.